Mike sat alone in the dimly lit living room, carefully removing his framed commendation certificates from the wall. The space around him, once filled with memories of his achievements, now seemed bare, as if his presence had already begun to fade from the house. The quiet rustling of bubble wrap filled the air as he meticulously packed each certificate into a cardboard box, sealing away years of dedication. A voice interrupted his task. "Mike, where were you? Why weren't you at my wedding rehearsal?" Brenda stood at the doorway, her voice tinged with urgency. "Mom's been looking for you since 6. She's really angry." Mike barely spared her a glance, continuing his task in silence. "Where's Mom?" Brenda pressed. "She just dropped off my real father at his motel," she answered, her eyes darting away as if the words felt foreign even to her. Mike paused briefly but said nothing. Instead, he picked up the box of certificates and carried it toward the kitchen. Brenda followed, watching with growing unease as he placed the box alongside several others, all packed and ready to go. "What are you doing, Mike?" she asked, her voice softer now, uncertain. "Mom cleared all those frames out 6 weeks ago." He ignored her, methodically ensuring everything was secure. Brenda hesitated, then lifted the hem of her dress slightly, a nervous habit that suddenly reminded him of the countless dance recitals he had attended when she was little. But now, she wasn't twirling on stage under the bright lights, dancing for the father who had raised her. Instead, she was rushing back into the living room, suddenly aware that something was very wrong. Mike followed, his eyes scanning the space. The realization dawned on Brenda like a slow-burning ember. Everything that had belonged to him, every trace of his presence on the walls and shelves, was gone. She turned toward him, her breath unsteady. "You're leaving us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. "Yes," he answered simply. "You finally noticed. I've been moving things for 4 days now, but neither you nor your mother cared enough to see." "Maybe that says something." A flicker of guilt crossed her face. "I'm sorry, Mike. I've just been caught up with the wedding." He met her gaze, expression unreadable. "You're still coming, aren't you?" she asked hopefully. Mike shook his head. "No, I won't. I thought my absence from the rehearsal tonight made that clear." "But why, Dad?" she asked, the words slipping out instinctively before she caught herself. Mike's lips curled into a sad smile. "Oh, so now I'm Dad again? 3 weeks ago I wasn't." Brenda shivered and hugged herself as if the realization had just struck her. She motioned toward the door. "Come inside, it's cold." "I'll wait," he said, his tone indifferent. "Call your mother first." Brenda quickly dialed, only to be met with voicemail. She left a hurried message, urging her mother to call back immediately, then sank into an upholstered armchair, her small frame swallowed by its cushions. She sat in silence, struggling to piece together her thoughts. Finally, she looked up at him. "Why didn't you come to my wedding?" "You must know why," he replied. "No," she insisted, her brow furrowed. "I don't." Mike could see it in her face, the sheer obliviousness of a bride caught up in the whirlwind of her own happiness. It saddened him, this extreme selfishness he hadn't noticed before. He sighed, deciding to be direct. "Brenda, ever since I met you, I have loved you. You were a chubby little girl of 2 with sticky fingers and endless energy, and I loved you as if you were my own. I still do." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "When I met your mother, she had just been abandoned by your biological father. You know this story. He was an alcoholic, and when she caught him with another woman, twice, she told him to change or leave. He left." Brenda nodded but said nothing. "She lost the house not long after. She couldn't afford the rent. Then she met me. We fell in love, got married, and moved in here with my 2 sons. We became a family." Brenda's expression softened. "You were the best father a girl could ask for," she whispered. "Even my friends were jealous. They couldn't believe you weren't my real dad." Mike gave a slight nod. "That's why it hurt when I realized I had been replaced." Brenda frowned. "Replaced? I was proud when you asked me to walk you down the aisle," he continued. "It meant the world to me. But you never canceled that invitation, did you?" She stiffened. "Your real father returned out of nowhere, and suddenly, I was an afterthought. You and your mother were so dazzled by him that I became invisible. And I knew then, I wasn't walking you down the aisle anymore. Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it again. You were so distracted by him that you didn't even notice I never rented the suit you asked me to, Mike added. Brenda's face crumpled as realization set in. I forgot, she admitted. I didn't mean to. Mike leaned forward. And what has he done to earn this place in your life? He abandoned you. He abandoned your mother. And now that you're getting married, he suddenly reappears? What do you think he's really after? Brenda's eyes flashed with defensiveness. You don't understand. He's changed. He spoils me, buys me anything I want. He's charming, He's the same lying, cheating bastard he always was, Mike interrupted. Brenda recoiled as if he had slapped her. Don't say that, she pleaded. It's not his fault, I forgot to tell you. I just assumed. You assumed, Mike repeated, shaking his head. That's exactly the problem. Silence hung heavy between them. Finally, he asked, Where's your mother? Brenda hesitated. Her eyes flickered away before meeting his again, a storm of emotions swirling within them. She knew exactly what he was asking. And in that moment, Mike saw it, the realization settling over her like a cold shadow. Her father had come back. But at what cost? Brenda's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. She didn't have to say it. Mike already knew. I wanted to ensure that 2 decades of my life didn't dissolve into a sea of deception. If nothing else, I hoped we could part with at least a semblance of mutual respect. So I told her the truth. That morning, I had found condoms in her mother's purse. They were still sealed in their packaging, which meant she hadn't crossed the line, yet. But the fact that she had them at all, just a day before the wedding, told me everything I needed to know. I had undergone a vasectomy long before meeting her mother, which meant they weren't for me. And Brenda had been on birth control since she was a teenager, so they weren't for her either. I watched Brenda's face carefully, searching for any flicker of surprise, any hint of denial. But she didn't flinch. She knew. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. You and your mother conspired to betray me, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. You turned our wedding vows into a joke. Was it romantic to you? The idea of your mother and father reuniting like some kind of fairy tale? Did it make it easier to trade in the Nissan I bought you for the Porsche he dangled in front of you? Brenda opened her mouth, but I raised my hand to silence her. Don't bother, I said. It doesn't matter. The fact is, you knew. And you did nothing. That tells me everything I need to know. Our relationship ends here, right now. I stood, crossed the room, and pulled her into a tight embrace. For a long moment, I held her, letting myself feel the weight of 20 years of love, disappointment, and betrayal. Then, I whispered my final words into her ear. I love you. And with that, I walked out of her life. As I turned back one last time, I saw the devastation on her face, the tears streaming down her cheeks, the way her body trembled with silent sobs. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking, desperate to reach her mother. Maybe she still thought there was a way to fix this. Maybe she hoped her mother hadn't actually gone through with it. Maybe she thought she could convince me to stay. But I was already gone. That night, I drove aimlessly, my mind consumed with the need to confirm what I already knew. I searched for the motel where the bastard was staying, desperate to see it with my own eyes, to witness the betrayal firsthand. But my search was fruitless. Eventually, I found myself back in the place I had once called home, parked on the street outside. Within minutes, the truth presented itself. What I saw wasn't what I had prepared myself for. It wasn't my wife, disheveled in a motel room, or her ex-husband gloating in triumph. What shook me to my core was the sheer panic on Brenda's face as she spoke to her mother over the phone. For 20 years, I had protected her from this kind of pain. But now I could do nothing. I turned off my phone, discarded the camera I had brought to capture the proof, and drove into the night. The next morning, the wedding went on as planned, but not as it had been originally scheduled. Instead of a bright and hopeful ceremony at 10 a.m., it was pushed back to 6 p.m., a hushed, uneasy affair. Melinda had spent the night searching for me, finally collapsing into exhausted sleep somewhere. The groom and his family scrambled to track down Brenda's biological father, but he had vanished. Just as I had warned Brenda, once he had taken what he wanted, he was gone. I later pieced together the full story. William had no other children. His second marriage had been childless, so perhaps he had simply wanted to experience walking a daughter down the aisle, to collect the moment like a souvenir. Maybe he had sought out Melinda for old time's sake, eager to relive their past. Or perhaps it had just been about his ego, seducing the woman who had once begged him to change. Whatever his reasons, once things became complicated, he did what he had always done: he ran. Rumors circulated that he had been found days later, badly beaten, his body broken. It was said that his wife had received incriminating photos of his infidelity and, in response, had not only thrown him out but taken over his father-in-law's business, making it clear he was no longer needed. By the time the wedding took place, he was gone. They had missed their scheduled time at the church, and though the priest agreed to reschedule, the damage had already been done. I never found out exactly when Melinda realized that the wedding dress she had so carefully chosen had been ruined. Perhaps she saw it crumpled in her hands and recognized the metaphor it had become. She called me. Again and again. I ignored her. The voicemails poured in. Pleas, apologies, desperate attempts to explain. She claimed that she had only gone into the motel to talk, that the condoms were nothing more than a joke. But the photos that arrived in my inbox told a different story. One showed her, standing naked in front of the motel door. The second was a zoomed-in version, capturing every damning detail. I sent a single response: "No thanks." And then, I blocked her number. Family gossip occasionally brought me updates, how she struggled to move on, how she hadn't been able to date anyone since. But I wanted no part in her regret. The bridge was burned beyond repair. Our divorce was swift. I asked for very little, and she did not argue. For a while, I lived with my youngest son, hiding my car in his garage. Both of my sons refused to speak to their stepmother, unwilling to pretend that what she had done could ever be forgiven. Brenda's husband eventually tracked me down, and I agreed to meet him. I had always liked the young man, and he pleaded Brenda's case, telling me that she had tried to talk her mother out of it. But William had been too persuasive, too overwhelming. He told me that the relationship between mother and daughter had grown strained since the wedding and that Brenda still held onto the guilt of what had happened. We saw each other occasionally, but I could never bring myself to call her my daughter again. I never asked about the details of the wedding, but I heard whispers, how Brenda had walked down the aisle alone, while her mother sat in the front row, haggard and tear-streaked. How even the groom hadn't been sure if there was one empty seat next to her or two. It didn't matter. 4 months I grieved. Not just for the marriage I had lost, but for the family that had fallen apart. I told myself I would never trust a woman again. And then, I met Molly. She was the widow of an old friend, and I met her by chance in a pub, exactly 1 year after my world had collapsed. With her, trust wasn't something I had to rebuild. It was simply there, as natural as breathing. I had never believed in soulmates. Not until her. For weeks later, I moved into her home, knowing without a doubt that she was the woman I would spend the rest of my life with. Her children embraced me as one of their own. And when her daughter asked me to walk her down the aisle, I knew at last that I had truly come home.